Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is George Barker and I am representing Griselda Art House. Thanks for joining us for this event, for this live event in conjunction with our current exhibition by Jann Haworth. You can view the exhibition online while we still remain closed to the public. You can view the show at gazellearthouse.com, and also there's a link in the chat section here where you can virtually explore the exhibition. For tonight's event, we're delighted to be hosting a conversation between Jann Haworth and Dr. Griselda Pollock. Since the 1960s, Jann Haworth has exhibited in major museums around the world. Her work is included in the permanent collections of institutions such as the Tate, the Walker Art Centre and the Smithsonian Institution, amongst many others. Dr. Griselda Pollock is an esteemed art historian and cultural analyst of international post-colonial feminist studies in the visual arts and visual culture. Alongside her many honours and achievements, she is the most recent recipient of the Holberg Prize. Before I leave you in the capable hands of Jann and Griselda, just a bit of housekeeping. We ask that everyone remain muted and switch off your cameras throughout the conversation. There will be an opportunity to ask questions here in the chat section. Hope you can all see that. And we will try and fit in a sort of Q&A at the end of the talk. But yeah, many thanks again for joining us. We're really, really excited and we're really grateful for Griselda Pollock for agreeing to take part in this talk, and Jann, of course, whose fantastic work you can see at gazellearthouse.com. So I will leave it in your capable hands.
Thank you so much, George, and good evening to everybody. It, in fact, is an enormous honour for me to have been invited to talk with Jann and to have had this unique opportunity to spend a certain amount of time online with her and becoming absolutely one of her most devoted admirers and followers, as well as learning so much more about this brilliant, extraordinary and wonderful thinking artist and making artist. So it's a great honor for me, and thank you very much to Griselda House for having given me this opportunity, and to Jann herself for her incredible generosity and openness and endlessly interesting thoughts and questions. So we're going to have just 40 minutes or so to talk, and there are so many things to talk about in her work. So we are going to start, in fact, and I want to talk a bit about your making. You know, we're looking at an image, and one of the things from the mannequin defectors, here we have a creature who's sitting on the floor who is composed of many elements, full of color, full of objects, and such a presence, and yet no face. So there's something very interesting about these mannequins, that so much of the history of women in art, including possibly even certain parts of your experiences, to be rendered invisible, not to be named, not to be recognized, not to be known. And yet what I love about the mannequins and throughout this exhibition is they are so present as they jump out of the windows of stores, or they, you know, the whole image, the surrealist image of the mannequin as this kind of strange, uncanny, half dead, half living woman object. And you have cut and sewn and pasted and painted so that they are really a kind of the counterforce to that whole tradition. And yet you are really, really interested in surrealism and all this question about fiction and fantasy. So can we start by talking about making your work, about what is the process that's involved in this picture that they're showing? We've got your soft sculptures, the sewing, the combining, the painting, the very funny references. There's a sort of, in a sense, there's almost a kind of Jackson Pollock donut there, as well as the reference to all these other artists. You've got your figures that you make, your component figures, these like the snake woman, etc. But you've also got the mannequins working with cardboard in the background. So let's just start with you in the studio and the pleasure you take in making things and your processes.
Well, I very much enjoy the actual process of sewing. It's very logical and it's sequential in that you do certain things first, followed by other things. The background to that was that my mother taught me to sew when I was 8. And I just took to that like a duck to water, and made, made all my own clothes really forever. And I think the form of making something in cloth is, as I say, it's very logical. And I think as a form to realize ideas, it was reasonably untouched in the early 60s. And so that became very appealing to me. Also, I also think it's very funny. I mean, there's a lot to say about humor in the work that I do, and that it's meant to be ironic. It's meant to be poking at things, and so this soft, warm, yielding form, allows me to work on a couple of levels, both an intellectual level and also a subversive level. I don't like sarcasm, but I love irony. And so I think in this particular one, this is a second piece after I did the donuts, which were the art history of the 20th century in donuts. And each one of those takes a particular area of fine art historical reference, and turns it into a donut. In this one, yes, it is abstract expressionism, and you can also see the donut that goes with the Merit Oppenheim fur teacup, and I just couldn't resist doing a fur donut. So it's both mocking and loving at the same time, and I enjoy the dynamic of trying to fuse those kinds of opposites, and I think the vehicle of cloth does a good job with that.
The work that we're seeing now, work in progress, is something right from now and still going on, but in or developing in recent times, etc., which you worked on with your daughter, Work in Progress. Tell us a bit about this, because obviously this does link right back, in a sense, to your question of having made the very iconic, with Peter Blake, made the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which kind of creates an array of heads, and it was a collage piece, etc. But this sense of who's missing, the invisible women or the forgotten women. Actually, today I looked up the names of all the famous women mathematicians to make sure that if you tested me, I would have at least got Katherine Johnson on the tip of my tongue. But we realise how much we've been deprived, and that's, I think, where we share this sense of what happens to the world if women are made invisible, and how do we make them visible. So perhaps you could talk a bit about the process, because this was made with a whole lot of other women as well.
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say about it is that it's a community project. So nobody could make a mural on this scale without working with other people. And so the idea of a collaborative is at the center of this, that you want to make something that really makes a huge statement about something that Tiffany Shlain calls the sort of rectifying, really, of our history of women's accomplishments, that we've been talking about scarcity for so long. We should be talking about abundance, and the women are there, a point that you've made, and it's just that we do not know our history. And so Liberty and I set out with this idea that we could do this with the community, with Salt Lake City, and that we could ask the mayor's office and the YWCA and University of Utah and things of that sort, and ask them if they would contribute and come into workshops and make portraits using the stencil graffiti process. And it worked really well. We set out to make just 7 panels in the initial work that we made. And now there are 15 panels, so the mural is now 60 feet long, and includes 300 women, international women of stature. We call them catalysts for change. So they are women who are catalysts for change in the arts, the sciences, and social activism. It's not finished. It's called work in progress for a very good reason. We're not done. We're simply trying to catch up with this mural with something of the past, which is not covering all the fields that we should cover, and beginning to talk about our contemporary women of stature and women who have contributed to change. So, I mean, the idea of a mural like this, it's something that when you see it, you're meant to be shocked. You're also meant to say, I didn't know this. I didn't know, you know, and the genesis of that is that I didn't know. You know, I was shocked how little I knew about my particular gender's history. So I think it's a journey, this mural, and in fact, it's been a journeyman mural. It's been to 24 different locations in 3.5 years. So it also has been very flexible because we've been able to reproduce it in vinyl. So it means that it can go into libraries or schools or universities very flexibly and very inexpensively. It also presents another challenge in that it can't be owned. I'm not going to be able to sell it, nor is Liberty, my daughter. We can't profit from it. It's a thoroughly honest project. And I think that cuts back to the whole graffiti movement and, you know, the kind of genesis of some of the ethical concepts within that. So, yeah.
Can we take up now, you've got this lovely quotation again about exactly resisting this idea that we somehow dig up a few women just to compensate our kind of damaged narcissism, whereas in fact this sense of how much we have lost, but how this reorganized. And I love the way in which you've used the sort of alternating kind of cardboard and different kinds of things to ensure that the visibility of diversity is there in color. But also this takes us on to this question, two big things, which is one, your engagement with certain kinds of things that have been deemed outside of art or of the edges. It goes back to surrealism and the kind of breaking out of classic painting and classic sculpture, etc., into collage or found objects, or you mentioned Merit Oppenheim. Collage is a very crucial part, not only sewing as a kind of collaging, but also what you worked with then and what you're working with now with these works. This takes me on to the sense that you've engaged so much from your childhood experience of Hollywood, being exposed not in sense to the arty-farty world in one sense, but to this incredible team of creative people that produced movies. We tend to consume movies by the images. You got backstage. You hung out on the sound stages with your father, who was a set designer, which means you saw the kind of the background, the backside of fiction as a kind of making. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about your Hollywood, you know, how Hollywood plays a role in leading to your way of thinking about making and the kinds of resources that it offered you beyond the sort of classic fine art, painting or sculpture.
Yeah, that, I have a problem in my throat. That's an important territory. When I went to St. Martin's on a visit from the Slade, I ran into Tony Cairo, and I was explaining the kind of work in answer to one of his questions, and he said this wonderful thing: everything is the stuff of art. And certainly that has been one of the great legacies of the 20th century, is that the stuff that makes art can be anything from a tin can to a twig, to oil paint and cloth. And I've never seen any difference in terms of value between what we consider to be the materials of craft, clay, fibers, wood. All of that is the stuff of art. For me, the idea comes first, and then you find form for it. The form for it has to be analogous or support the idea. So the it may be that what I'm thinking about is actually a poem. So when I wanted to write about Scheherazade, or I wanted to do an art piece about Scheherazade, it first started as a poem, and that was the right way to approach the subject before doing eventually a painting. And I think if you are, really sitting in the middle of possibilities, you are doing a collage of the whole world of what might be possible to make this particular idea appear in the world for the first time. Plus the fact that if you have an intersection between an idea with a different kind of form, with a new take on it for the time that you live in, maybe you have a chance that it will be original. Maybe you will actually hit on an invention. And inventing things is key to me. I don't want to travel down a hard beaten trail that hundreds of people have been down. I want to strike out and find something that's a bit of a tangle, something that's difficult and challenging. And there again, maybe it's fresh. The cardboard pieces that are on the screen at the moment, the cardboard is a wonderful material, like fabric. It's soft and yielding and warm, and it's made of wood, and it's recycled, and all of those things. It also goes with the topic here, which is the idea that this is a march. These pictures were made in 2017. They are protest pictures. And the fact that in the marches, people carried signs. So it's reflective of the actual art making of people, much like the community murals. That people make art the night before the march, and they take their art and they carry it through the streets, as did we. We carried the banners of the work in progress mural. So the idea of materials, it's key that it's really important what the material is, because it reflects the idea to its best. But then it's also, I'll take anything. I mean, if I was on a desert island, I would make art out of sand and palm leaves and things I found. And I think the idea that the world has an abundance of materials for you to reflect on is just it's a piece. It's a wonderful toolkit.
Can we move the slides on a little bit just to take us a few? Because here, of course, you've got the mannequin defectors with their banners. Again, this lovely mixture of comic books and frames and the dynamic of a certain kind of graphic art and the way that the bodies which you're kind of rewriting. But the energy of these articulated female figures. So maybe we could just move on a little bit more as well. See the next slide. At the same time, you are deeply indebted or too enthused by color. That there's something, because it's collage and it's like pieced quilts, but you're great admirers of the Gee's Bend in Alabama, this community of extraordinary African-American Black women quilt makers and their power with the image. Can you just say, just briefly, in a sense, how you're drawing inspiration from, not just a matter of admiration, but there is a kind of relationship to it, because color is a very important part of your practice, isn't it?
Yeah, well, color is very emotional, and I find these quilts just devastatingly wondrous. Liberty, my daughter, and I, had many conversations about these quilts. They transcend into a wordless area for me, because they're just so powerful and so pregnant with love. And there's an exhibition in London now of the quilts of Gee's Bend, and I know they've been exhibited over the years in Australia and in the United States and Texas and so forth. They are just amazing, and I think the sensibility that comes through these quilts as the pinnacle of quilt making, as far as I'm concerned, is the freedom with which they're expressed. They are not tied to a geometric form. They just break out of all of that, and it's like African American music. It busts the bounds of the expectations of music, and I think they were provided a way through for my daughter Liberty once when she sort of came up against a dead end in her work, these quilts meant so much, you know. So as per inspiration, they're amazing. Look at these soft, you know, conjunctions. I mean, and the sense of color is super. We have to say something about Quilts of Illusion. This is Laura Fisher's book. The intelligence that is within quilts, the passion, the color, the meaning, the use of things that would otherwise be thrown away. In the prairie, it was the flour sacks. You don't waste the flour sacks. You sew them together as something to keep you warm. And the very idea that something is functional, that in the canon takes it away from fine art, is nonsense. How lovely it is to have a cup that you call a piece of craft that really is a piece of art, you know, that you love that cup every time you use it. You are covered up by a quilt. It just means it's double valuable. You can use it as well as, you know, it's a piece of art. So I feel entirely passionate about this work. I think there's one more. Could we go to the next one? Because it's, is it the, oh no, it's not there. Okay, well, go online and look at the quilts of G's Ben. They are amazing.
Yeah, and you talk about them in another conversation with the wonderful Joe Aplin, when you discuss also in the sense that they encode time. There's a time of making, there's the time of the memory. So can we move on, I think, to one more? I think that was a very important part about this too. Then in a way, your work, because the sort of, the quilts are in a sense themselves frameless. They're fields that they create in a certain brilliant kind of, some kind of abstraction which isn't abstract because it's so full of, as you say, intelligence, meaningfulness, time, the energy, the conversation that goes on with it, the process, and the beautiful kind of inventions, etc. But you're also interested in these works. When I'm just going to look at these two works, maybe the next one will keep ethical responsibility with us. Can we see, we'll come back to her in a moment, but the Dreaming Painters, a little bit further on, you'll find, yes, that one, etc. So you actually use frames, and I've been puzzling about this in a kind of terrible art historical kind of way, which you do, but I just am so thrilled about this Dreaming Painters, because on the right you're evoking the wonderful Lee Krasner's works of the 1950s, these extraordinary collage paintings that should have made her incredibly significant. Greenberg ignored them. But you've then got, you know, you've remade Picasso, Ray Johnson, Matisse, and Hannah Höch. So there's a kind of, you've invoked the conversation with these other kind of artists, but you've turned them into, in a sense, colored patchwork of your own. But also there's this frame, which is also like, it's like the back of the canvas, you know, you turn it around and you see the support. I mean, you know, you build the whatever the word is, I've forgotten, it's gone out of my head. But also I'm thinking about, you know, flats in theatre, or the kind of things that you get in sets, which kind of holds the kind of madeness. And then you have the magic of what you hold on them, which is perfect for painting because there's a surface there, but there's also depth. You seem to really like the sort of the fact that you can play with, and when you talk about vinyl, you also talk about layering and getting that effect, which is at once a surface, but it also has a very physical presence. So maybe you could talk a bit about Dreaming Painters. It's not just Picasso, it's everybody.
I don't know how to reduce it down, but there's so many points there. I'm fascinated by stretchers. I like exposing the stretcher, the frame, and the idea that you're showing the raw making of it. The idea started with a triptych that I did of Alfred Jarray's Ubu, which was a political painting about the Bush administration. And I flipped the flats around, which were his instructions, Alfred Jarray's instructions to the performance, that you take the drama flat and you flip it that way so you're exposing the actual stretchers. And that was a radical thing to have done in the late 1800s. So that really interested me. So I picked up on that. The idea of the Dreaming Painters was that all of these painters were deceased. They were my art history, and that were they deceased and dreaming of their work, they might dream of little shards of their paintings. And so I wanted to look intently at their work. It turned out by accident, they're all collage artists as well, but that is a whole nother conversation. But the little shards were to reflect the film strip. And the film strip was where I entered this whole process. That when I came to Sundance first from the United Kingdom, I wanted to find a way to fuse the comic book, the graphic novel, the patchwork quilt, and the film strip, because I felt they were all the same thing. They were sequential time, and that if I could find a way of fusing those concepts, and then looking again at what I would call the 4 of the 5 cardinal areas of painting, which is the still life, the nude, the portrait, and the landscape. If I could find a new way of combining those things, I might create something original. And so into that came vinyl, because that's like the cells in animation and film strip. And the vinyl allowed me to have a palimpsest, a 2-layer painting, where as you pass the painting, the shadow that is projected onto the wall, i.e. in movies, it is something that changes. So the viewer actually changes the composition of the piece. You can see the drop shadow here. And so the piece is both a film strip in itself that it projects, but it also means that the viewer is making the composition. Also, the seams then become these ghost lines that are, also articulating something within the picture. So the idea, I didn't know when I first started this if I could sew a curve to a curve. I didn't know if it would stretch flat at the end of the day. So it was an absolute huge leap of faith, and also an extension of my own process into a territory that frankly was terrifying, because it all could go so horribly wrong. And the Picasso piece was really where I really began to push the envelope, that it's all those different colors are actually different shapes that are sewn together. So what I do is I stretch a piece of canvas, rabbit skin glue it, paint it, and then I've done a drawing that is my pattern, and I cut up the canvas that I previously painted to make the image. So it's a wickedly complex sewing process that evolved through these paintings. So through these particular paintings, taking the old process of send the student to the National Gallery and make them paint a copy of a painting, in going into these artists and investigating their process, I learned a huge amount. It's like going back to art school, just a huge volume of process and intention and composition, and what was possible with the materials that I was working with. So there's much more to say.
There are hours more of these wonderful discoveries. Everything is like a gem, etc. And I forgot to mention Louise Nevelson, because she is one of the great ones that you obviously loved. She was one of the first people in about the artists of the 1950s I first gave lectures about, when I was just beginning to work out that there were women. And I feel she's been so
yes. Could I say 2 things about her? Well, one thing about her, she had an exhibition that nothing sold, and she burned everything from the exhibition. That was amazing. And also, what was the other point I wanted to do? Oh yeah. The Lee Krasner, the things that made her collage were torn up works from Pollock and her own work. So there was this wonderful tearing process that she entered, making those collages. And I think that's one of the reasons they're so vibrant. When she was being taught, her tutor, is it Hossman or which, he begins with an H, he came to her drawing board, took her drawing, quartered it, and threw it on the floor and said, now that is art. And that just burned me. That's why that picture is quartered. So yeah, references.
Lovely. Can we move on to the next one, please, of the next image? Okay, so you can see then you have your deep art historical knowledge, which enables you to engage, and I think that's also very important for young artists who are with us this afternoon or this evening, in terms of this sense of how the artist uses the museum is not to follow the art historian's chronology and say, oh, this is from the 1920s or the things. This is just a huge treasure house of possibilities and insights and remarkables. Can we go on to the next one, please? I think we're getting, okay. We could talk about corsets and the body. I'm keeping an eye on time, but certainly you have engaged with this, and there's a wonderful story you tell about being commissioned to make a kind of articulated mannequin that was going to be a bunny, which you then withdrew and turned into the maid. But you also engage with this sense of making female bodies that are sort of both breaking out of their frames, but also register the constraint. And the corset seems to be a figure that has fascinated you. There's this one, and also I think there's the shepherd's bush. Is that the next one? Or there's the one after this, I think, which is also the shepherd's bush corset. Which
it also references Venus de Milo, and thinking about, hey, you're just going to be interested in this bit, so that's what we'll do. So there's that comment in these, and also going way back to the beginning when you were saying the faceless women. The face garners so much attention that if you actually remove the face, then you can concentrate on the whole picture. So there is that notion there. That's not the key reason, but that is a reason behind it. Also, that you, with a face that is not there, you're having every woman, and you're not particularizing a portrait or a certain woman or a certain look or a certain period. So it tends to make it more generalized, I think.
I think we have Mae West in our little portfolio that we're going through here. Perhaps we could find her, because that's the one. Okay, we have our wonderful Minnie. There we are. We have her. The Mae West dressing table. Lovely photograph of you with it. Could you just talk about the making of this piece? Because it's not what it appears.
No, the idea behind it is that I wanted to do a dressing table, and I wanted to do a portrait of Mae West. But my father delivered fur coats to her when he was a high school student. He came out alive, I will tell you. Anyway, but she fascinated me because she was a woman with a brain, with a sense of humor. She got away with not being beautiful. And I just think she's amazing. I would not be interested in doing Marilyn Monroe or the more mainline beautiful women of the 60s, but Mae West really fascinated me as an individual. She said that the only woman she would ever trade places with was Mabel Stark, who was a lion tamer. And she's an amazing woman. And this particular piece is a dressing table, which is about regard, the woman looking at herself, doing her makeup. It occurred to me that I could make a looking glass very easily by doubling the elements. The brush, I buy 2 brushes that are the same. I buy 2 ashtrays that are the same, 2 perfume bottles that are the same, and one goes inside a kind of box where Mae West is a bas-relief figure. And then you have the other one on the outside. That brings us to a point that the viewer is always important to me, not as an audience, but as somebody who is engaged actually physically with the work. All my work is life size or over life size to make the viewer into a small person. So it's that you have a physical relationship with whatever it is that you're looking at. And in this case, usually this is hung wrong in that it's hung as a picture. Really, it needs to be down at the level it would be if it was a table, and a seat in front of it that the viewer would sit at, and their reflection would be Mae West. So it's about reflectiveness and reflecting on some of the points that you talk about how to look at pictures. And I think, that engagement is really important. And the weird thing is that when you sit there, if you are lined up with her and you blink, it looks like she blinks. That's not the point. That is just a sort of a fateful event. But it has, the kind of, again, the engagement of the viewer in the piece itself.
Right, can we have the next image, I think, just to keep sure that we are covering, because soon we'll be giving time for people to ask things. There are issues where, in the next one, I think it's the charm bracelet's going to come up, but I think that's, did we go past this? Yes.
Yeah.
The charm bracelets, two other things that perhaps we should talk about. You made a very interesting comment about this, because this is a very large piece, right? And you talked a bit about the sense of how to make somebody appear to be small on set.
Yeah.
How you make the invisible, you create these huge things, etc. And obviously gigantism did come in through the various other artists of the sort of early 60s in different sorts of ways, using soft sculptures as well, but also not kind of ironic and just a one-off joke like a huge hamburger or a giant-sized hammer. There's something much more complex in this, which again comes back to something which is run through, I'd like to pick up, is sort of a very deep sense of a lived life, the life of your parents, of your grandparents, of being located in a particular moment of American history. And some of your work has obviously responded very much to recent American events. You mentioned George Bush, also the 2016 election that never was the one that you wanted. But maybe you could just talk about these big pieces that are kind of soft sculpture objects. And we can also look, if we go to the grandparents, or to the couple, which is, I think, there as well, we can talk about these pieces which come from very early in your work.
One of the things that happened when the concept of doing things in cloth popped into my head on the top of the number 30 bus in London was that it allowed me to speak about my own past, that it gave me form to actually catch up with myself, so that I could picture California, picture some of the experiences there, picture my father's production design work, the fact of a stand-in, the fact of a set, props. All of this relates back to film. That I didn't call it an installation, I called it a set when I made a room for my figures to be in. And so it's a set, it's a stand-in, it's a dummy, it's a false creation from the Body Snatchers. So the idea there of time, and the time that is film time or real time or biological, bio time, my past is all connected with this. So the charm bracelet is a linear time piece, in that each charm represents a holiday that I went on with my parents. And I had that actual charm bracelet. It was stolen. And the idea of making a 9-foot version of that, I found the idea of making a chain in cloth absolutely hysterical. I thought it was so funny to be doing, this chain in this squadgy form. And it's also like the big fat hands in cartoons, the way that the 3-fingered Disney hand is like that. It's puffy, it's odd. And so combining all of that, but also catching up with my story, it's really like a 3-dimensional comic strip, the charm bracelet. And likewise, the quilted faces, the cloth faces, the old lady is really a memory of her time. It may be that her face is made of, like the wonderful quote from an anonymous quilt maker, everything in my life is sewn up in that quilt. My husband's waistcoat, my ball gown, my daughter's christening dress. So it's it's that kind of thing, to try to catch the time, catch the story, catch my own story, catch up to being 19 years old in London. And the cloth was not seen as, oh, hey, I'm going to do Claes Oldenburg, because Claes Oldenburg hadn't done it at that point. And white was because I'd seen white rolling out of the plaster room on the studio lots. So the whiteness is about that. Yeah.
Just go back to the coloured version of these, that, and then these figures, because I mean I think it's very important that there are some very interesting conversations, not influences or derivations, but conversations. There's a wonderful Swiss artist called Eva Epley. I don't know if you've come across her, who was married to it'll come to me in a moment. Anyway, the person who was also married to Niki de Saint-Phal.
Oh yes, yeah.
The Swiss art, Tanguy, Jean Tanguy, but Eva Epley. But we keep finding the disappeared women, because also it's Patty Bucher who actually made.
Yes.
Did the sewing, you know, and then Hannah Wilkie was also part of this thing of using felt and various kinds of things. So there's a whole interesting conversation to be had once we bring all the women back into this. We've just come up to the almost time to open up for certain conversations. Can we go right to the end and just see that there's no other images that we are missing to discuss?
I'd just like to do, well, the cardboard we'll have to talk about another time, but I'd love to get to the last two slides if we could. This is the, that one is the mural that we just finished. That it was just a Herculean task. It's 6,000 square feet, and it was commissioned by Scott Anderson and Zions Bank. And there are 300 women in this mural, and it was done, half the mural was done during the pandemic. And there's so many stories tied up in this mural. It's highly emotional to me, and it was the most wonderful experience, I can't tell you. And this is up on a 7-story building at the moment. And the next one is the Dennis Hopper mural, which is also in Salt Lake, which if you could get to the last slide, it's Dennis Hopper in a parking lot, basically in a camera reflection, and he's reflected 4 times. And the capstone on this is that it's called time lapse, and so much of what I'm concerned about is that time element in art and in reflection and in conceiving of what you do as against a background historically, and also in terms of your contemporary visions. This is Dennis Hopper in 4 stages of his life, as an older actor, and as you know, at the height of his career, then high school, and then as an egg and sperm at the very smallest reflection. Each time this is reflecting on the lens of a camera. And Dennis considered himself to be more an artist than an actor. He said he had spent more time as a visual artist than he did on stage, as it were. And so, yeah, all of those things. I mean, I love the whole concept of working with the community and working with agency. For example, this one we worked with the company Picture Line and Jens Nielsen to actually conceive of what it's going to be. And I think that exchange out of yourself as the dominant control is the most wonderful experience. So again, it's a collage of people in that case, you know, so you're working with people and with minds, but it is that kind of welcome and embrace, I think, that that is, you know, really important to me. So yeah, democracy and equality, all that.
Well, thank you so much for answering my questions and engaging this way. I think it would be lovely to be able to find from our listeners questions that other people have had from this extraordinary, rapid, but very, very rich traverse through the range of your practice as it's presented at the Gazelle, and also in terms of your wonderfully sort of ethical and political sort of understanding of your whole sense of a practice in time and place. So I think we need to follow up with chats. And George, would you like to take over mediating that?
Thank you so much, Griselda. That was so wonderfully directed. Thank you.
Thank you. George, you're muted. Are you going to, or else I can pick up? Somebody has asked about the collaborative process on Sgt. Pepper's cover. Obviously, this is perhaps most known to people, but could you perhaps talk a bit about that?
Yes, I think it was a very natural process. We started in a conversation with Paul McCartney, looking at the artwork that had been created for the cover by Simon and Marika. And in other words, the cover had been designed. And Robert Fraser felt that there was perhaps another cover that might be possible, and suggested to Paul that we have a conversation about that particular cover and make suggestions about another version. At that time, at the EMI studios, we didn't do that. Paul and Robert came to Peter and my studios at the time, and we then, at that meeting, really constructed the idea of the cover. And we were standing up in my studio space the whole time, so that will tell you that it didn't take very long, and came to a kind of conclusion about different aspects of it. There was no pre-existing artwork whatsoever, despite what is said by certain people. You know, Peter came up with the idea of a crowd. He wanted the Beatles to choose their heroes. They chose about a third of the people who were on the cover. Peter and I chose the rest because they didn't choose enough. And I didn't want any lettering imposed, so was, you know, interested in working with Joe Fgrave, who did the drum as the title of the album. And I wanted, you know, flowers in a kind of civic arrangement at the front saying the Beatles. Also, Peter would have done it as a collage, I believe, and I wanted to do it as a life-size set, basically, so that the Beatles could walk onto it and not have two separate photographs that were put together. So yeah, briefly, that's what it was like, and it was perhaps simpler than people imagine. And it was hard work making it and staining the photographs and all of that. But yeah, it was an escapade, and it's good to put that in context to say at the time, it was a graphic design job. I was also working on a film work for my dad, who was working on Half a Sixpence, kind of ironic juxtaposition of Tommy Steele with the Beatles. Yeah, it was another, you know, work project, and not much bigger than that at the time.
Thank you. I've got two other questions here, which is, one is about cardboard, which seems to be this, you know, is it a material, you would say there's a lot to be said about it. I wonder if you could say that. And then I think somebody else is very interested also in about the significance of quilting. You know, is there a family history? What brought you to quilting? So those are two material questions. And then somebody's also interested about your experience in Britain and America and moving backwards and forwards. So if we could talk about materials first, and then...
Okay. Keep me on track, because I'll probably lose the last two, but I'd like to go to those. Cardboard is such a wonderful material. What I was doing in these pictures is I wanted to take on the problem of the diptych. I loathe 2 and 4 in artwork. I like 1, 3, 5, and 7. I like odd numbers, and to me, a diptych is really uncomfortable. Taking cardboard and then using both the positive shape and the negative shape. And by that I mean, if you cut out a hand, you also have a remaining piece, which is all the bits in between. And so I wanted to, on the one side, have the positive shape of the hand, and on the other side have the negative shape of the hand, so that we were looking at two versions of the same thing, and that maybe we would begin to reflect on, you know, positive, negative, bright color and its complementary color, black and white, and so forth. And so creating a dialogue between the two works. Also taking something away from having a central image, which pop art does over and over and over again, as does art. It always puts something important in the middle. It's a cheap trick, and it gets people engaged. If you have a hole in the middle and the smallest thing in the middle, it's tough. It's tough to make an interesting picture that way. So I wanted to look at that, and cardboard gave me that kind of facility. So yeah, that's about cardboard. What was the next one?
was about whether quilting has any personal history or family history, or how.
Oh, yes. Yes, my step-grandmother was a quilter, and so I had a quilt on my bed at all times. And I could find dresses that I had in that quilt. And so it was physically part of my life. My mother made a quilt, which is on the wall right over there. Let me show you. Right there. And that was a family history quilt. So yes, it is in the family, and yes, it's something that, you know, has interested me always. Certainly I take, I take responsibility for kind of messing with the project, with the process rather. And I hope possibly extending the possibilities of it through the processes it developed out of the Dreaming Painters. It's a real challenge, to work with quilting if it goes free form and isn't on the geometric level, but the geometric level offers you amazing opportunities as well, as per the Quilts of Illusion and things of that sort. So deep love of quilting. And the frameless thing we should talk about more too, the soft hanging tapestry quilt, no frame. That's interesting topic to think about.
Yeah, there's a kind of dialectic between the comic strip and the Hollywood celluloid and the painting frame and all the things, etc. And then this other kind of free form of sort of generative image making that comes also through collage, which I think is an interesting form. You lived for a very long time in Britain. You came from the States, from your studies in California, hit London at the sort of really hot time, what was going on at the Royal College and St. Martin's, the new sculpture, and then obviously at the Slade, and there's Paolozzi as one of the people teaching there, and the ICA is beginning to give a framework for contemporary art in Britain that isn't the sort of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth and abstraction creation, and that element must have been very dynamic. But then you lived here and went into the countryside, but you went back to the States after about 30 years, is that right? You went back to the States in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just talk about, because you suddenly precipitated into a completely different United States from where you had grown up in the 50s in California, but you're also witnessing that a lot in your art is very much engaged now with place and politics in the States. Could you say
yes, absolutely. And I just I don't know. I think I've had an angel guide my timing, because it really, growing up in Hollywood during the retouched photograph golden age of, gods and goddesses, and then having the good fortune to come to London just as, Beckett and Osborne and Westcott and Evening of British Rubbish and all of these wonderful this theatrical explosion happened. The genesis of media with the expansion of television and wonderful magazines that supported the arts and commented on the cultural shifts that were happening. I mean, there was this wonderful period, in British creative culture, right across from hair to shoes to, clothing, photography, film, theater. And I think I would like to just say, I think the theater lit the fuse, not the Beatles. And then coming back to the States in the beginning of the 90s was, so fortuitous for me, because it allowed for an expansion of the things that I was devoted to, which I've always been involved in teaching. And so I came to Sundance, where my father had a home, and wasn't particularly, on the zone that I later was on there. But at first, I started an art shack there and a hot glassworks studio, eventually a school, did their programming at the Sundance Resort for exhibitions. And then very quickly was involved with the Sundance Institute and the labs that happen every summer there, which is a genesis for theater productions and film and documentary film. And to be there at that point, just as Bob Redford was saying, he wanted to make documentary film as important as narrative film, which was like, you must be kidding. anybody has, was just amazing. I mean, absolutely a gift. And so as a point of, you know, kind of bookending the Hollywood glamour fiction narrative thing, then with this much more political, much more socially responsible, in-depth vision of what filmmaking could be, was, I mean, just phenomenal. And there's no way of overstating that, the impact that work at Sundance has had on both film history, but also on, you know, political activism and so forth.